Josh Shapiro took office as Pennsylvania's governor in January. At the time of the heinous murders of the 11 worshipers at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue, he had been the Attorney General. In the aftermath, at a time when the plan was to prosecute the murderer under Pennsylvania law, Shapiro proclaimed that the murderer deserved the death penalty. More recently, though, two things have changed. One, after he took office as governor, Shapiro announced that he no longer supported capital punishment, and he called on the legislature to abolish it. Two, the murderer was prosecuted in federal court under the laws of the United States rather than those of Pennsylvania. After the jury convicted the murderer and determined that he should be executed, Shapiro's statement did not mention the death penalty. He said, "Our justice system did its job and found the murderer responsible for the deadliest act of anti-Semitism in American history, guilty." We could easily dismiss Governor Shapiro as a flip-flopper. I suspect, though, that while Shapiro has staked out a clear position on the Pennsylvania death penalty, he's ambivalent about its application in this horrific case. Governor Shapiro is Jewish, which seems relevant to any discussion related to the Tree of Life massacre. Perhaps Shapiro's Jewishness is also linked to his shifting position on the death penalty generally and his reluctance to endorse the death penalty even in this most heinous case. Shapiro is hardly the first Jewish leader to express ambivalence about the death penalty. Torah prescribes death as the punishment for a plethora of offenses, not only heinous crimes such as murder and rape, but also transgressions that we may consider religious matters, from idolatry to working on Shabbat. Our rabbinic sages could not abolish any of the Torah's laws, but they made capital punishment very difficult to inflict. Maimonides taught it is better and more satisfactory to acquit 1,000 guilty persons than to put a single innocent one to death. Despite designating death as the penalty for many crimes, Torah does not make that result easy. In this week's Torah portion, we read, "A person may be put to death only on the testimony of 2 or more witnesses. No one shall be put to death on the testimony of a single witness." The Talmud makes the requirement even more stringent, much more stringent. Prior to the crime, the witnesses must have first warned the wrongdoer that he will be liable or they will be liable for the death penalty if they carry out the offense. A famous Talmudic passage disallows circumstantial evidence to an extent that seems extreme. Rabbi Shimon imagines seeing an evildoer running after a victim sword in hand. Then the pursuer and his prey run into place where the rabbi cannot see them. The apparent murderer then emerges with his sword dripping in blood. The rabbi goes and finds the victim convulsing and gushing blood. But the rabbi did not see the stabbing. In this case, he is not a sufficient witness to testify that he has witnessed a murder justifying the death penalty. In the case of the Pittsburgh massacre, one may ask whether the rabbis of the Talmud would have been satisfied to exact the death penalty. Nobody had time to warn the murderer before he pulled the trigger. Moreover, while there is no doubt that the convicted killer was indeed the murderer, and he has confessed, I am not certain that at least 2 of the surviving witnesses report having seen him pull the trigger. The sages were dealing with daggers, not automatic weapons. Still, multiple witnesses, worshipers who survived, including some who were wounded, the rabbi and police officers who responded to the scene, gave eyewitness testimony. SWAT operator Stephen Meskin gave a lengthy account of his direct confrontation with the murderer. Officer Michael Smigda said that he briefly made eye contact with the gunman after arriving at the Tree of Life synagogue, and he identified him in court. SWAT operator Clint Timmons recounted words the murderer exchanged with him as he was arrested. Timmons testified that when he asked why he carried out the rampage, the murderer responded that he had had enough. The officer said that the murderer, in a matter-of-fact, conversational tone, claimed Jews were killing children and all Jews had to die. Officer Daniel Meade testified that as he approached the door, he saw the murderer pointing a weapon at him. Audrey Glickman, a member of the Tree of Life congregation, told of her significant other, Joe Charney, who died before the trial, but had told her that he had stood face to face with the murderer and his long gun, a man with blue eyes. She testified that he had looked the gunman in the eye and saw the barrel of the gun. In a famous passage, the rabbis of the Talmud say that a court that executes a transgressor once in 7 years is characterized as a destructive tribunal. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says once in 70 years. Arkansas and several similar states qualify as destructive by this standard. The death penalty is carried out so routinely, even capriciously, not to mention racial discrepancies, that such states may be said to pay insufficient reference to human life. They are destructive. Respecting the Pittsburgh case, we must ask if the federal courts are destructive. The federal government has carried out the death penalty a total of 16 times since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1988 after it had been held unconstitutional in 1972. 13 of those 16 executions, though, occurred in one 6-month period, July 2020 to January 2021. Except for the last 6 months of President Trump's administration, the federal courts may not be called destructive, especially when we think of some of the people executed. Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, for example. There must be a balance. After all, the same passage that condemns a court that decrees the death penalty too often as destructive goes on to say the same about a Sanhedrin that would never execute a murderer. Judaism stands ambivalent, much like Governor Shapiro. Not at all eager to carry out the death penalty, insistent on being certain that a person who is executed is guilty beyond any doubt, not merely beyond a reasonable doubt. Certainly the case with the Tree of Life murderer. You have perhaps noticed that I do not mention the murderer's name. He has forfeited the right to that dignity, even as he may have forfeited his right to breathe the same air from which his victims once drew life. By contrast, the names of those pious Jews whose lives he so viciously ended must always be remembered. Let their names be our loving benediction tonight. Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irving Younger. May their memories always live a blessing. Amen.